My name is Abhishek Moran, and I've written the Fundraising Blueprint, a guide to raising capital with confidence and an insight into the hidden nuances of the venture capital world. Today, we have Chris Wirasinha on the podcast. Chris started his founder journey in 2005 with Pedestrian TV, a media publication, before selling it for $100 million. Chris is now currently building Linkby, an ad tech revolutionizing the way that top brands get their content into top-tier publications. So far, he's raised $9 million from a range of Australian investors and is currently raising his Series B with regular trips to the US. Chris shares all his tactical tricks and tips in terms of managing investors, thinking through when to raise and how to raise, and who to raise from. Here's my conversation with Chris. Thanks for joining me today, Chris. Really appreciate it. You've got a storied background, storied history. But for those in the audience who don't know too much about you and your journey, you're currently the founder of Linkby. You've raised about $9 million for that journey. But you've also had a journey before Linkby, and that's growing and selling Pedestrian TV for $100 million, which is an insane achievement for a media startup. I think that kind of speaks for your experience in fundraising and that journey and managing capital for a business. Fundraising is all about capital allocation and thinking through. And yeah, I think you've done an awesome job so far. But before we get into any of that, I kind of want to start off with figuring out what the craziest or the wildest thing an investor has ever said to you.
The wildest thing that an investor's ever said. I mean, investor conversations tend to operate within a fairly constrained environment. So I feel like there's not necessarily things that are too wild. I mean, there was an investor in San Francisco who loved swimming in San Francisco Bay.
Yeah.
And you have to avoid the seals and things like that. And so I think he was trying to get me to go for a swim with him in the bay, which is freezing.
Yeah.
Avoiding seals and things like that. And sure. I'm not the strongest swimmer.
Sure.
So that was definitely a bit of a, how do I not let this person down, but also not drown?
Yeah.
So look, that's maybe up there. I mean, yeah, look, like during the sale process with Pedestrian, we had some, very colorful conversations with some sort of, big personalities in media and things like that. But yeah, look, I think trying not to die in San Francisco Bay is probably one of the biggest ones. Yeah.
That's pretty fair. I feel like there's always like a weird and wacky story associated with like American VCs. There's something about it. But yeah, I guess thinking through like the processes for, fundraising for Linkby or bootstrapping Pedestrian, how did you sort of compare and contrast both of those journeys? Like Pedestrian, you started when you were really young and just getting started out of uni, and Linkby is kind of a bit more of a tenured one. So
so Pedestrian, literally 20 years ago, almost to the date, I handed in my resignation notice at the first ever agency job I had, because I was going to go start this Pedestrian journey. So I mean, it's been a while. I think back when we started Pedestrian, VC just probably wasn't even an option.
Yeah, okay.
It was 2005, sort of 5 years after the .com crash.
Yep.
Just there wasn't, I don't think Blackbird or Airtree or any of the big names in Australian VC were founded. I just assumed that if you wanted to start a business, you had to just sort of save up some money, not go to Europe that year or travel and just put that money into the business and started, and you start with a small amount of money that gets bigger over time, as opposed to, I suppose, what the VC world is, where you often get given the largest amount of money you've ever seen, and then you're expected to be able to manage that money wisely. So I do think that bootstrapping journey in the early days of Pedestrian and throughout the entire Pedestrian journey did teach us really elite capital management, because every single dollar was a dollar that we had built up and earned ourselves. And every single decision we made was essentially, this dollar could either come out of the business or stay in the business. Obviously, for most of the early years, those dollars are staying in the business. And so then when I was starting the Linkby journey, the biggest difference was that it was a business that had a global opportunity. And I think to grow globally, and when you've got a business like that, it's not impossible to do it bootstrapped, but I think it will take a little bit longer.
For sure.
And when you can see a clear line to, well, when I put $1 in, I get X amount out, that's potentially when you have a business that should be VC funded. And I think that's a big topic that we could probably jump into, which is like at the starting point, should my business even receive funds from VCs or angels? Because am I going to be able to guarantee that type of return or exit outcome to those partners?
Absolutely. And I think like it's always an interesting one chatting to second-time founders because, you know, if they've kind of followed the VC pathway for their first startup and for the second startup, there's a bunch of learnings there. But I always find it interesting chatting to people who've bootstrapped their first one because I find that some of those founders find a lot of the company building principles that you need to have or that you need to sort of intimately understand for a VC-backed business really tough to grapple with. Was there anything that you found really uncomfortable raising VC capital and using it to grow your business, or anything you needed to unlearn through that?
I mean, I wouldn't say there's anything that jumps to mind. Maybe the only thing is that when you're running a bootstrap business, you are more cautious in terms of that sort of when does revenue come in versus when do I hire? And I think it's potentially, you know, if you look at the Linkby story, maybe we've been slightly more conservative as a result because there's parts of that bootstrap DNA, you know, within what we're doing.
Yeah.
I don't think that's necessarily held us back because we've managed to grow fairly consistently. But maybe you could argue that if there was someone who just hired without waiting for some of those revenue outcomes to land, possibly could you move faster? Like you probably could move faster, but you're probably taking on more risk as well. Yeah. So we're probably a little bit more risk averse than maybe your average startup. But then at the same time, we've never had to go through a round of redundancies or something like that. I think the way, part of that is also the value that we place on human capital. And, you know, I think that term human capital is almost the opposite of how I feel about it, is that, you know, these people are trusting you with their careers. You have a responsibility to be a good steward of that career for that person. And so I think just sort of seeing it as a number where it's like, well, we can hire all these people and we can always make them redundant feels like very counterintuitive to me, and
absolutely
sort of quite lacking just sort of basic empathy. So I've always wanted to make sure that we can build the business, but in a sustainable way that also looks after the people that have entrusted their careers with us.
Yeah. I think that's such an interesting sort of thread to pull on, where one of the things that I sort of talk about in my book is very much the incentives that sort of drive the people, the investors on your cap table. And where I'm going with this is very much, I think there is a type of investor that just expects hyper growth from the get-go. And there's a type of investor who is happy to sort of, you know, see 2 to 3x increases in revenue every year, and happy to sort of have what is traditionally seen as a conservative approach, but maybe like the best building approach, right? To growing a company. I
feel as if 2 to 3x a year is not too bad. Still, that's, you know, I mean, depending on how big the numbers are. I mean, if you're doing $10,000 of revenue, sure, like you should be growing a lot faster than that. But as the numbers start to get bigger, that's a pretty healthy growth rate. So
I mean, yeah, like traditionally that was kind of what was accepted in VC, and now you see a bunch of the AI journeys and the ARR numbers that they're putting up, and it's like completely out of whack. Like these companies are growing 5 to 10x year on year.
Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for global frameworks like ISO 27001 and SOC 2, and the latest Australian frameworks like the CPS 234 and Essential 8, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Over 10,000 global companies like Atlassian, Handle, FireAnt, Indebted, and Tactic.io use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Start with Vanta's ISO 27001 compliance checklist, which breaks down the process into clear steps, so you can spend less time on compliance and more time growing your business.
One of the things that I'm curious to understand from your perspective is, did you think about the incentives that your investors have when taking their capital? Investor A could be from like a massive fund. They need to return a lot of money. Investor B might have a smaller fund, don't need to return as much, happier to go with like a lower return outcome for them.
Definitely. Yeah. I think you do think about I think that's a really good question, is things like, what's your fund horizon, for instance, which is something you might not necessarily be thinking about when you're raising capital. You just think money's money. But, if someone's coming towards the end of a fund cycle, there might be more pressure on you to drive an exit outcome quicker, or especially as you start to go down the funding track, like growth funds, for instance, a lot of them are talking to investors about 5 to 7 year horizon. So it's much shorter than a typical VC fund. And so I think knowing that is important, knowing the type of fund. I would say that probably a boutique fund gives you more access to the actual investors. Larger funds, unless you're a real breakout, you probably don't get the same level of love, is what we've sort of seen. So, we raised money from OAF, who have been brilliant. We've had lots of access to them. They've been incredibly helpful in follow-up rounds. They've been really helpful on the hiring front when we've needed it. They've just been an awesome partner. And I just always felt like we can speak to them and kind of get hold of them when required. And they also, when we need the space, we get the space, which is important as well. I think that's the thing. You don't want your investors you don't want your role to turn from running the business to just servicing investors, which I think is a real trap that some founders can fall into.
Absolutely. Like there's a lot of time wasted in investor management, unfortunately. And like part of why I wrote the book was so that founders understood how to actually manage the process efficiently. There's a lot of different things that investors will make founders do, and like a lot of random hoops, a lot of hidden nuances to the entire process. And I kind of wanted to spotlight that in the book and call it out and give people the frameworks towards sort of, navigating through all of that. Did you find that going through the fundraising process, there was like a subset of like really helpful investors, people willing to lean in, even if they didn't give you capital, you had productive conversations, and like a subset of time wastery type VCs, or like was it a bit more blurred?
I think for the most part, VCs have been pretty good through the journey. We've always found that I think the larger Australian VCs, they will run their process quite smoothly. They'll get back to you with feedback quite quickly. They'll give you a quick no or yes. They won't sort of keep you on the hook. So far, we've found the journey to be quite smooth. I think one of the biggest things we did find was the differences between maybe the Australia and the US. I think Australia, just in terms of doing business, is quite straightforward. People will largely tell you where you stand. I think in the US, there's a bit more of a focus on having a great meeting. And so sometimes you have these meetings in the US and you're like, oh my God, that was the best meeting I've ever had in my life. And then you never hear back from the person again. Because they've just become so schooled at doing a meeting well and leaving everyone feeling warm and fuzzy. And I think there's a little bit in the US of not wanting to miss out if this company happens to be the next big thing. And therefore, they'll never tell you no. They'll always sort of tell you not yet.
Not yet. Or maybe later.
Which is, there's probably some truth to that in that, there's a lot of companies that people pass on that then execute really well. And you do have a conversation with that same VC 2 years later, and they actually are a lot more serious about that conversation. But I think that can be quite hard when you're an Australian founder that's used to getting fairly straightforward feedback in all forms of kind of business meetings and things like that, to then kind of hit the US and everything's very positive, but not always going to lead to an outcome.
Have you figured out any tells or any signals that an investor is going to do this during a meeting? Where you're kind of like 10 minutes in or 15 minutes in, you're like, this person isn't that interested, or like...
A great meeting almost has the person that you're presenting the business opportunity back to you.
Cool.
So when they start to, and when they really understand the problem that you're solving, if someone gets excited about it, they actually start to almost pitch your business to you. They're like, I love this. I get it. It's like, there's this and there's this and there's this market opportunity. I think that's when they've really tuned in, they've listened and they've understood. And ultimately, like the best investors you will have are people who truly understand your business. And I think also, the other tells after that would be obviously how quickly you're getting to a second meeting, if there's even a second meeting, how engaged they are in the data room. So, we typically like to have the data room ready to go. And then we have the investor calls. They're invited to the data room within 24 hours. And you want to have that engagement's really important. If there's very little engagement, if there's no questions coming in off the back of your data, then chances are that person's someone you should be probably crossing off your list.
Yeah, makes sense. And I guess during these meetings, how do you sort of handle investor bias or sort of their own prejudices or weird and wonderful behaviors that they might exhibit?
It can be hard. And in some ways, I think the worst investors to present to are ones who think that they know what you do or think that they know the space. And sometimes those investors are brilliant. Sometimes they know the space inside out. They get it straight away. But a lot of the time, if they know something about the space, they'll bring these biases to the table and they'll assume that you are like business A or business B that they've seen. So in, Linkby works in kind of the marketing tech, advertising tech sort of world, but we have very little exposure to the programmatic chain, for instance. But then there's investors who've got knowledge of how the programmatic advertising chain works, and they assume that your business operates like businesses that are over there because we're broadly in the same industry. And I think that that's been an issue when it comes to kind of investor bias. In some ways, presenting to an investor who has very little idea about the space can be simpler because you can just paint the picture for them. And as long as you do that storytelling effectively and can get them hooked on the idea and the concept and the market opportunity, it's something you can get people quite excited by. So sometimes biases make things a little bit harder when actually you would think that some background knowledge should make it easier.
Yeah, I think that's always an interesting one. From the investor perspective, I meet companies every day where going into the meeting, I have no clue anything about the market that they're in. I understand what the business is doing, but I don't have any resonance to the problem. And so I'd like to kind of unpack that a bit more from your perspective in terms of how you told the story, or like what were like maybe the frameworks that you use to sort of tell the Linkby story or even the Pedestrian TV story.
100%. I think, and that's something that I'm getting better at and something I've really learned through going through these VC processes. So, we're now at a Series B raise. We're right in the middle of a fundraise for that. And we're much better at storytelling and building the big picture than we were at the seed or even the Series A. So I would always tell quite a personal story at the start in this sort of seed round, talk about my journey with Pedestrian, and then talk about sort of why the business existed off the back of that. And I thought that that was quite effective. But I think the problem was that it actually made the problem kind of small and the solution small, because it felt like something that, sure, this is important to me and this is important to the world that we operate in, but I don't think I painted enough of a kind of global changing the world, like, why this is important, why there's no market leader in the space, and that's what we're building here. So now at the Series B level, I mean, obviously we'll wait to see if the round closes, but I think we're telling the story much better, where we're saying, brands are trying to get coverage across all of these new partners. It's every brand invests in this. It's a $60 billion market and there's no go-to digital player. And we're building that. That feels, it's a much bigger story that we're telling, even when we talk about product, rather than sort of talking about what the product looks like now. The best meetings that we're having is when we're really selling investors on the vision we have for the product in an AI first world and what that looks like, because they get excited about that. They see the potential, and that's essentially what they're investing behind, is the potential. I think the challenge for Australians is where we talk ourselves down. Like we don't want to go in and big ourselves up and paint this big picture, and the thought of going up and doing a like Steve Jobs style speech or something feels a bit cringy. But that's kind of what you have to do. You have to really lean into that. Like, why is this important? Like, what's the biggest version of this, and how do I sell that in? As opposed to what are we doing right now, and how do I talk through that? Because what you're doing right now is probably quite small, but the bigger picture vision of what you're building towards is important, and then showing the steps of how you're going to get there, I think is what we've learned, at least through the process.
Yeah, and I think you've just called out like one of the interesting things just at the end is what I like to call kind of like the murky middle. It's like, okay, you've got what you're doing now, you've got what the big vision is, but what happens in the middle? Like, how do you communicate that to an investor such that it's like the sequencing makes sense, or there's logical jumps between all of this stuff? Do you have any frameworks for that?
I think, to be honest, the murky middle is probably not something you have to worry about too much in that first meeting. I think, one of our investors said this to us the other day, and it rings really true, is that the first meeting is just all about getting a second meeting. So really, you just need to leave them with enough of a hook that they go, I like this.
Yeah.
There's something here. These are the people who are going to solve it. I'm going to look at the data. I'm going to then go and actually read the deck. Realistically, like at the murky middle is probably something that will come up at the data room stage,
of course,
where they're looking at your financial model and they're testing whether this actually stacks up. But the biggest purpose of that first meeting is just to get to that stage. It's to capture their attention.
Yeah.
So I don't know if, unless they're asking you about it, if you want to focus too much on
that stuff.
The kind of the rigorous day-to-day. And also, especially earlier stage, you don't even know what that necessarily will look like. And it could go a whole lot of different directions. But what you do know is, like, what is the problem that we're solving, and why is this problem big enough and worth enough money that a VC should care about it? Yeah. And ultimately, I suppose, why are you the best team to solve for that?
Yeah, I think that's really important. You've kind of called out one of the other things that we sort of cover in the book, which is like each stage of the fundraising process is like, okay, a gate to unlocking the next. You go from like your pitch deck is to secure that first meeting. It's not to get investment. And the first meeting is to get to the second one. The data room is to get the third and the fourth. And after that, you go see the IC and all of that. Like, what is your sort of framework or advice for founders who are pitching in that first meeting to get to a second, and maybe so on and so forth? I guess it sort of bifurcates after that, but at least the first meeting usually quite standard for founders.
100%. I think you want to warm investors up. That helps a lot.
Yeah.
So definitely at future rounds, having a regular investor update that goes out monthly, that just keeps people in the loop so they know how the business is tracking, they know how the business is performing. I would say that's true even of a very early stage company.
Okay.
Maybe if you know that you're going to be raising VC funds in 3 months, 6 months, you're starting to kind of do friends and family rounds.
Yeah.
Why not just start sending emails out to VCs, you know, kind of gathering that data and keeping them in the loop of that journey of what you're building? I think a lot of curious VCs will actually then start to reach out to you. And if they're reaching out to you, then you're winning the battle already.
Yeah.
I think that's something that we've utilized really well. And it builds faith in your ability to deliver. It allows people to follow along with the story. And it means that first meeting isn't necessarily a completely cold meeting. So like keeping people up to date and investor updates is hugely important. I think in that meeting, it's not feeling like you have to talk too much. You just want to really make a few points land. And so, you know, making sure that you're really hitting home on those so that they leave going, okay, I can see it. Big market, you know, this is the team to solve it. And I buy into the vision.
Absolutely.
That's really what you want to leave them with. And that will lead to kind of the follow-up.
I think it's like an interesting trend that we're sort of picking up through our conversation. It's just like this, how do you create an environment of excitement? Or it's very like emotional, this entire process, right? I think that's, it's probably maybe one of the most underrated parts of like founder knowledge in terms of how to fundraise is creating that emotion, creating that anticipation, that excitement, and all of that. Do you think that was maybe like the best thing that you did through a fundraise? Or maybe what are some of the 1%ers that founders can take away and try for themselves?
I think trying to keep the process condensed.
Okay.
Because one way you can create excitement is by actually having momentum. And one thing I see often in kind of fundraising with a lot of businesses, especially earlier stage founders, is it takes a really long time. And so as a result, you've got investor meetings dropping in over the course of weeks, sometimes months. Whereas if you try and condense it into as short a period as possible, maybe like a couple of weeks, then you're starting to build momentum where you might get a term sheet, you might get a second term sheet. You can start to get feedback very quickly and move people along. So if you think about how a company is sold, so something I learned from the M&A process in Pedestrian was it was very structured. We had dates that basically said, this is when we're doing intro meetings, this is when we expect the term sheets by, this is when due diligence will happen, and this is when the deal is going to close. Those dates might always shift and move a little bit, but having some sort of understanding for yourself of what your timeline is a good way to keep investors excited and honest. And I think the best processes that I've ever been a part of or heard, you know, build investor excitement by having lots of momentum.
For sure.
And that's the best way, because investors they have FOMO in the same way that other people have FOMO, where it's like, if there's a business that looks good and it's got a great team, if there's a US business that wants to back it, then the Australian funds will want to be part of it. If there's an Australian fund that wants to back it, the other Australian fund won't want to miss out.
Yeah.
And you can think about what that does to your ability to get better terms or get a term sheet faster, or maybe get a slightly higher valuation, or maybe to raise the full amount that you want, or even slightly more than you were initially anticipating.
Definitely.
There's a lot that you can do to kind of build that momentum and excitement.
I think you've called out like a really interesting and tricky problem for early stage founders to solve is like, one, timing your fundraise at that early stage. Sometimes it's hard to see, okay, like you're sort of kind of stuck where you're just plodding along, you're doing stuff, but you're in a weird zone where you don't have any money. So you're just doing what you can, but you've also got a bunch of investors that you're talking to, that you're updating regularly or whatever, and no one seems to be leaning in. I think something in the book that I talk about is finding your key inflection point, or like, what is the thing that can be unlocked by capital versus time? Like, I think that's such an important thing for founders to realize is investors will only lean in once you've kind of de-risked as much as you can for the stage that you're at. And the next inflection point or the next jump up is really unlocked by capital. It's not time. They can't just have an excuse where it's like, oh, like I'll just wait it out and see what happens. It's always like, oh, if you put in $1 million, you'll get 2, 3, 4, maybe more, who knows, but you'll get that out of the business in revenue or whatever. Do you sort of have any frameworks for founders to think about that, or even just think about how they can plan even when things seem a bit uncertain at that early stage, at that pre-seed or seed stage, where it's not always clear when the timing is right?
Definitely. I think there's almost two parts to this, where the first one is your business even VC fundable?
Yeah.
And that's like a really important question to ask yourself, because I think because of all the success stories of companies and, you know, people only see the wins. And there's this assumption, I think now, where founders of all types of businesses feel as if there's huge amounts of investor money that they have a kind of right to.
Yeah.
And when you actually look at the type of businesses that get funded by VCs, they're very specific. So they tend to be enterprise software. They tend to be on a sort of monthly subscription basis, and they'll have certain growth metrics that are being hit. Whereas there's been some fantastic businesses in Australia that have been built that just would never get funded by a VC, but they're some of Australia's most successful businesses, whether it's consumer brands like Zimmerman and Aesop, or it's, even Afterpay got passed on by most VCs, major VCs in Australia. And, that's been, incredible. So it's just because you're building a business, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to be a VC fundable business. And I think that that's the first step to make sure that you're not wasting your time with VC conversations. I think if you look at your business and you go, yes, this is a business that should be funded by VC, then the next step will start to unfold. And that's where, as you said, your time is the first investment that you'll put into your business. And then at a certain point, you will start to realize that my time is stretched to this point. If I could buy more time for as a resource of other people, this is what the output would be. So it would be when your inputs start to become constrained, and that if we had more inputs, it would lead to X. And that's kind of what investors are essentially looking at. And being able to prove out that initial traction of this is what we've done with our time, and this is what we're able to deliver on. So that could be, we have 5 test customers, and the test customers are all seeing X, Y, and Z business outcomes. They're all asking us for these new product features. And when we add those, we'll be able to then deliver this much revenue, and we've got these many other clients in the pipeline. You're starting to show that initial traction to an investor.
For sure.
So that's a really great stage to be at. Sure, you can, even if you've got an even bigger challenge that you're trying to go after, you can be doing it more sort of back of a napkin, like this is the idea, pre-seed, but then you still need to have some reason to believe why they should be backing you. And I think whatever you can do to show that traction, even if it's just almost running it like as a consultancy, where you say, well, I've helped these brands do this, now I'm going to build the technology to automate that. That could be enough to get someone to back you initially.
Yeah, I think that's a super valuable piece of feedback around thinking through the outcomes that you've already delivered and the outcomes that you want to deliver in the future, right? I think a lot of founders kind of approach the fundraise process where they're like, hey, I'm running out of cash. I need money to survive, but don't have like a good use case for the cash, nor do they understand what the outcomes they can drive from that capital. Is that something that you notice between like your seed to Series A jump, where maybe at seed you're like, hey, I think we can achieve this, and at Series A investors sort of like held you account to those things or like talk through those milestones?
Yeah, I think the further you get along, the more it becomes about what are you actually doing and have you hit those milestones that you said at the previous round, and it starts to become much more transparent because a lot of the investors have probably seen what you said you would do.
Yeah.
And then they'll be able to judge you against that. And I wouldn't get too upset if you haven't hit every single goal, but better businesses will deliver on what they say. And so I think that's also about when you present numbers at the seed round, investors will discount those numbers. This is a tricky thing, right? It's like how bullish you should be because all investors want to see a business that can become a really aggressively growing business that generates and gets to 100 mil ARR, or more, and can get to like a unicorn status. But then there's also calling BS on numbers, and there's a sweet spot somewhere in between where, and I wish I could tell you exactly where you need to sit. Like I've seen some businesses numbers, I'm like, you're never going to hit that. That's the number you're going to be hitting in 10 years time from now. So you want to make sure there's some reality in the forecast and the numbers versus so you build credibility, but you also don't want to present anything too conservative because then the investor will just assume that you're not backing yourself and the business doesn't have the growth trajectory that would make it a VC fundable business. Yeah,
I think the interesting thing there is very much, if you downplay your ambition, people think you have no ambition. If you exaggerate it, people are like, this guy's crazy or this person is crazy. The framework that I have sort of for finding that middle ground is very much thinking through the assumptions behind these forecasts and being able to like point to some source or some justification for why that assumption actually exists. And I find that founders don't necessarily do that all the time, unfortunately. But that's like the big unlock. The best founders are able to sort of reverse engineer an assumption and explain to you like, okay, cool, this is why we think we're going to be able to hit this unit economic figure or grow at this rate or whatever. Maybe the last question to ask is there a piece of commonly given fundraising advice that you think is just flat out wrong?
Ooh, that's a good one. I know that through the process, the wild thing is that, founders typically tend to be people who have taken on big challenges in their lives and they typically have done well, I think, kind of probably take on lots of those challenges. I know going from Pedestrian and, then starting the Linkby journey and talking to investors, you're used to hearing yeses in your career because whatever you've done has worked and it's got you to the point where you're brave and bold enough to start your own thing. And then all of a sudden you start a VC process, and most VC processes, you'll hear a lot of no's. No matter what the business is, it's going to be predominantly no's, which is fine. And that takes some getting used to, because if you've had a blessed career and, you're used to really positive meetings and everyone kind of being on board, and then all of a sudden you're in this very competitive environment. Because the thing to remember is like VCs are typically investing in about like 1 in every 1,000 pitches or something that they receive.
Pretty close,
Which is wild odds, right? If you think about anything else, if someone said you've got a 1 in 1,000 chance of this coming off, you would be, that feels risky, right? But you sort of enter this process assuming you're going to get the right outcome. So look, you just need to kind of be prepared to get lots of no's and not let that diminish your confidence and your faith in what you're doing. It's, every no feels like a king hit, and then you get knocked down and you just have to like pull yourself back up again and, be confident again in what you're building, and understand that as much as every no stings, all you need is one yes.
Totally.
And then everything kind of flips and changes and, you get to kind of where you need to be. So I think that, I don't know if it's necessarily like wisdom that has been passed down that's, kind of I'm refuting, but it is something that I've found through the process to be very real and humbling as like a kind of, someone who's been able to have a great career and then, kind of is off on this sort of venture.
Absolutely.
And you need to kind of also then not take it personal, which is difficult. And I think you can kind of, it's still something I'm working on, but it's not, they're not saying no to you. They're saying no to the business within their VC framework that they operate in.
Of course. And I think that's the important thing. It is still a VC framework. There are businesses absolutely that fit outside of that and can be amazing, can be huge and great and everything that a founder would want. So it's a good like return back to reality for people, I think, to sort of have that viewpoint when having these VC conversations. But yeah, I mean, this has been an insight-packed podcast, and really appreciate you being transparent and sharing your wisdom with everyone. So yeah, thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Abhi. I'm really excited about your book. Like, I think I wish that I had a book like that when I was starting the VC process. Like, it's got, there's not enough information out there that actually dives into the nitty gritty of what you need as a founder. Everything's very big picture and a bit general. And, people like to talk theoretically about what you need, but like being able to see what a cap table looks like pre and post raise, like even what a cap table is for a lot of founders is just wild. So it's awesome that you've put it together. And I think there's so many founders who'll get so much out of it.
Yeah, hope so. I appreciate the kind words. Thanks so much.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to that conversation. I really hope that you've learned a lot and picked up some really practical tricks and tips for your fundraising process. If you're keen to learn more or get a better insight into the hidden nuances of the venture capital world, then feel free to subscribe to the Superfluid newsletter or buy my book. Both links will be in the description below.